California task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Content warning. It contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. Contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
VII. Medical experimentation. Federal and state governments have allowed doctors and scientists to experiment on the bodies of African Americans and have at times conducted dangerous medical experiments on African Americans. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service began its study of syphilis, known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, which promised free medical care to hundreds of poor black sharecroppers in Alabama. 345 Over the course of 40 years, the government did not treat the subjects, though treatment was available, and sought to ensure that the subjects of the study did not receive treatment from other sources. 346 40 of the wives of the black sharecroppers and at least 19 children contracted syphilis during the study. 347 The government did not prosecute anyone for the deaths and injuries that were caused. 348 African American bodies have been used for major medical advancements and experimentation, without any compensation given to those who were involved, or to their families. For instance, scientists at Johns Hopkins University were treating Henrietta Lacks, a black woman, for cervical cancer in the 1950s. 349 Without compensation to her family or permission from them, her cells were used extensively in scientific research to develop modern vaccines, cancer treatments, in vitro fertilization techniques, among other medical advancements. 350 Doctors and scientists repeatedly failed to ask her family for consent as they revealed her name publicly and gave her medical records to the media. 351 Like so many enslaved people, Lack's body was used for medical experimentation without her consent and without compensation. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved contraceptives, such as Norplant, which were disproportionately distributed to poor black women and young girls in schools. 352 states offered poor women financial incentives for using Norplant, however, due to concerns about complications and effectiveness, Norplant's distributor eventually discontinued it in 2002. 353 Similarly, in 1973, many black women had filed lawsuits alleging that they were coerced into sterilization, often under the threat that their welfare benefits would be taken away if they did not submit to the procedure. 354 The coercive use of contraception and sterilization by the legal system and welfare system has forced black women to choose between financial freedom or prison time. 355 African Americans have also been subjected to harmful experiments conducted, facilitated, or allowed by the government in the 1950s. The Central Intelligence Agency reportedly attempted to test biological weapons by breeding millions of mosquitoes and releasing them in black housing developments in Florida and Georgia. 356 residents living in these areas showed symptoms of dengue fever and yellow fever, and some died from these illnesses. 357 In Pennsylvania's Holmesburg Prison, Dr. Albert M. Kligman conducted numerous experiments on mostly black incarcerated Americans throughout the 1960s. 358 incarcerated individuals filed lawsuits for their injuries due to this abusive experimentation. 359 Dr. Kligman was temporarily banned from experimentation by the Food and Drug Administration in 1966. However, clinical research on incarcerated people was not banned by the government until decades later. 360 In the 1990s, the New York State Psychiatric Institute and Columbia University conducted experiments on black boys by giving them doses of the now-banned drug fenfluramine to test a theory that violent or criminal behavior may be predicted by levels of certain brain chemicals. 361 Consequently, federal and state governments allowed or participated in abusive experimentation on black children and incarcerated people throughout the nation. California, home to an extensive eugenics movement, California had the highest number of sterilizations in the United States. 362 In the 1920s, black people constituted just over 1% of California's population, but they accounted for 4% of total sterilizations by the state of California. 363 By 1964, the state of California sterilized over 20,000 people, one-third of all sterilizations in the U.S. and more than any other state. 364 The sterilizations were authorized by law and performed in state institutions, hospitals, and prisons. 365 Dr. Leo Stanley, a eugenicist, performed forced sterilizations at San Quentin State Prison and was responsible for further segregation of the prison medical facilities. 366 He also used the testicular glands of an executed black man for his experiments, without obtaining the consent of the man's family because his body was not claimed. 367 In 2018, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation glowingly described Dr. Stanley as a doctor who pushed prison medicine into 20th century. 368. Between 2006 and 2010, almost 150 people imprisoned in California's women's prisons were sterilized without proper authorization while giving birth. 369 Many of the women subjected to forced sterilization were Black and Latina. 370 Kelly Dillon was forcibly sterilized while incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla when she was told she needed a surgery to treat an ovarian cyst. 371 She was not aware of the sterilization until she requested her medical records with the help of a lawyer. 372 Dillon said, "It was like my life wasn't worth anything." She said, "Somebody felt I had nothing to contribute to the point where they had to find this sneaky and diabolical way to take my ability to have children." 373 After her release from prison, Dillon founded Back to Basics, an organization fighting for justice for survivors of forced sterilizations in California. 374 In 2021, California became the third state to offer reparations payments, setting aside $7.5 million for victims of forced sterilization. 375. In the state of California, Elmer Allen was illegally injected with plutonium at the University of California, San Francisco Medical Hospital in San Francisco. He was likely never informed of the consequences of this. 376 The university later acknowledged that the injection was not of therapeutic benefit to him, which was a requirement for medical experiments on people. 377 The federal government created a committee to investigate the government-sponsored radiation experiments, after which President Clinton issued an apology. 378. 8 Medical therapies and technology. The history of experimentation and discrimination has led to the exclusion of African Americans from modern clinical trials, due to the mistrust this has sowed among African Americans, resulting in continuing health disparities that harm African Americans. 379 Prior to modern research, there has been a long history of black bodies being stolen for dissection and anatomical investigation without informed consent. 380 The Freedman Cemetery in Dallas, excavated in the 1990s, contained the remains of African Americans, which were illegally used for dissection or stolen. 381 Today, African Americans are less likely to be in clinical trials for the development of medication, vaccines, or other treatment, which can exacerbate health disparities. 382 For example, although sickle cell disease primarily affects African Americans, there is a great disparity in research funding and attention paid to this genetic condition. 383 Algorithms are widely used in U.S. hospitals to refer people to health programs that improve a patient's care. However, at least one widely used algorithm was found to systematically discriminate against black patients. 384 This algorithm led to black patients receiving less referrals for programs that provided personalized care, despite being just as sick as white patients. 385 African Americans are less likely to be treated for skin diseases due to the lack of medical research and training for diagnosing skin conditions for those with darker skin. 386 Most medical textbooks and journals that assist dermatologists in diagnosing skin disorders do not include images of skin conditions as they appear on African Americans. 387 Images of darker skin with skin conditions caused by COVID-19, skin cancer, psoriasis, rosacea, and melanoma often do not appear in medical textbooks and journals. 388 Doctors routinely miss these diagnoses for black patients because they are not trained to identify or treat skin conditions for black patients. 389 Consequently, discriminatory medical research and technology has resulted in worsening health disparities that harm African Americans. By 1964, the state of California sterilized over 20,000 people, which accounts for 1/3 of all sterilizations in the U.S. Students at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, 1898. The English sociologist Harriet Martineau wrote in 1838 that, the bodies of colored people exclusively are taken for dissection because the whites do not like it, and the colored people cannot resist. Subjects of the Tuskegee syphilis study. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service began its study of syphilis, known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, which promised free medical care to hundreds of poor black sharecroppers in Alabama. Over the course of 40 years, the government did not treat the subjects, though treatment was available, and sought to ensure that the subjects of the study did not receive treatment from other sources. Courtesy of National Archives.